So today, Nvidia aimed to put the final nail in the coffin for AMD's long-lived budget GPUs with the launch of their new GTX 1650. Priced at $149 US, it does sit right between the extremely popular RX 570 and RX 580, so to realistically compete in this price range, it does need to offer performance that is comparable to these two GPUs. So today we'll be testing it against several other GPUs in popular titles to see whether or not the new GTX 1650 is the new budget king. So let's go through the specs quickly, as I know a lot of you just want to skip through to the gaming benchmarks. So far, this is Nvidia's most affordable and lowest performance GPU of their most recent Turing architecture, and most notably, we're working with 4GB of GDDR5 memory with 896 CUDA cores with a boost clock of 1665 MHz. So it's significantly cut down from the GTX 1660, which potentially does leave room for a GTX 1650 Ti down the road. The model that we've got here for testing is the Gaming X from MSI, which out of the box does come with a factory overclock, a slightly higher power limit, and also a beefier cooler when compared to the base models available. Something worth noting here is that there are a few base models out there available without power connectors, seeing as the stock TDP of the GTX 1650 is just 75 watts, meaning that those cheaper models can be powered entirely by the PCI Express slot. This means that if you are using some old OEM Dell or HP system without PCIe power cables available, you could potentially just drop in the GTX 1650 to squeeze out some solid 1080p gaming performance without having to upgrade your entire rig. The Gaming X that I've got here does have a 6-pin power connector to squeeze out a little bit more performance from the GPU, and so I will be looking briefly at overclocking after the stock benchmarks. So let's jump right into gaming benchmarks, and today we're solely focusing on 1080p gaming in today's most popular games. Of course, all GPUs were tested on the same test bench, which packs high-speed memory and an overclocked 8700K. This gives each GPU the best chance of producing the highest result possible. So starting with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the GTX 1650 averages 41.7 FPS and is pretty much equal to the 3GB GTX 1060, which is heavily constrained for video memory in this particular benchmark. What we really want to know though is how it compares to the RX 570 and the RX 580, and honestly it doesn't look good so far. The RX 570 is almost 14% faster here, and the staggering fact here is that it's actually the cheaper GPU. Moving on to Apex Legends now, which is a recent addition to our benchmark stack, and here we see similar results. For most of the benchmarks that you'll see today, the 3GB GTX 1060 does actually beat the GTX 1650, so just don't draw any conclusions on these two yet. Here we're seeing the RX 570 14.8% faster than the 1650, so in terms of price to performance, the AMD GPU here is the clear choice. You can also notice a significant gap between the 1650 and the 1660 in terms of performance, a gap which could potentially be filled by a 1650 Ti, or the RX 570 and RX 580, which are still dominating in this end of the market today. Here the RX 570 has an insane 27.1% lead over the more expensive 1650. Now solely looking at the GTX 1650, it does seem to average around 60 FPS at 1080p and sits right between the 1050 Ti and the 1060 6GB from previous generation. Following with the theme of this review though, the RX 570 is 13% faster. Overwatch was introduced solely for this review, seeing as it is a popular esports title that does favor Nvidia hardware, but still here the 1650 is beaten by the RX 570 by 14.6% on average. It's important to note that the performance here in a vacuum isn't bad at all for $150, but when placed in the context against the competition, it does fall short. The 1650 manages 48.7 FPS on average in The Witcher 3. Here it's 23.6% faster than the 1050 Ti and 16.4% slower than the RX 570. So there are a few games where it does fall short of that 60 FPS mark at ultra settings, and if you'd like a stable 60 FPS, you'll likely have to drop the settings here to around medium, or you could just get the RX 570 and you're pretty much there already. In Rainbow Six Siege though, we've seen the performance favor Nvidia's Turing architecture heavily. As an example, we can see the 1660 Ti basically tying the GTX 1080 on average FPS, but even with the Turing boost in favor of the 1650 here, it still can't catch the RX 570. The theme continues in For Honor, where at 1080p, the new GTX 1650 does get by with around 60 FPS on average, which again is decent on its own, but against the cheaper RX 570, it is significantly slower. In fact, the only game tested here where the GTX 1650 can beat the RX 570 is in GTA 5, where it does have a 5.4% lead. If the GTX 1650 posted this sort of performance consistently, I'd call it an okay buy, but it doesn't. Most of the time you're going to see the RX 570 come out on top, and for less money, it's the easier choice. When we take a look at the performance per dollar chart here, we can see the 1650 does actually present okay value to the table, very similar to what we've seen with the GTX 1660. It's just that when the RX 570 has such an aggressive price at the moment, it just can't be beaten. In fact, for the 1650 to just match the RX 570 on a value level here, it would need to be priced at $110 US. It actually would need to be a little lower than that, considering that we benchmarked the flagship model from MSI, not the actual $149 model. Realistically, this model will sell for around $170 to $180, which is starting to approach RX 580 territory. In true Gaming X nature though, this card was absolutely rock solid in terms of thermals and noise levels, where out of the box it settled in at just 61 degrees C at an ambient room temp of 21, with the fan speed at a pretty relaxed 35%. I was able to overclock it a bit further though, with a plus 160 MHz offset on the GPU and a plus 800 MHz on the memory, and surprisingly this barely increased the GPU temperature or fan speed at all. In Far Cry 5, this gave us a 10.8% boost on average FPS, but you can likely expect lower performance gains and just lower performance overall from those base models without a power connector and increased TDP. So overall, the price and performance of the GTX 1650 isn't overall bad. It presents, similar value to the GTX 1660 as we saw, but it's just when the RX 570 exists at the price that it does, the 1660 really can't compete. In fact, with the prices that these RX 570s are going for, $129 for the 4GB model and just $10 more for the 8GB model, that is truly an insane deal. And no, I don't believe that the lower power consumption of the GTX 1650 is enough to offset that performance margin. At this end of the spectrum, I don't think power consumption really matters that much. The fact that some GTX 1650s don't require a 6-pin power connector though is an interesting fact, because as I said in the intro, you could potentially just drop this into an OEM system that doesn't have 6-pin power connectors available. You can't do that with an RX 570. So if you're in that position and you sort of don't have the money to upgrade your entire system or buy a new power supply, that could be a potential option for you. That's where the 1650 could be quite suitable. As always guys, I'd love to know your thoughts on the GTX 1650 down in the comment section below. So let's get chatting, let me know what you think. And also of course you can find all of the links in the description for all of the relevant hardware that we've discussed today, in case you are planning on upgrading to one of these budget GPUs. As always guys, a huge thanks for watching. Consider subscribing down below if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one.